It was a steamy and hazy afternoon like any other. Late in a war that most back home had written off and were actively trying to forget. As Colonel James Pewitt and his Wizzo, Lieutenant David Bubba Craighead, manned F-4E 37MC, tail number 68339, belonging to the 421st Tactical Fighter Squadron at Da Nang Air Base, South Vietnam. This was their second mission of the day, after flying strikes against North Vietnamese Army columns pouring towards the DMZ through Route Packs 1 and 2, marked by Fast Facts, Gunsmoke, and Stormy. Both airmen were already fatigued and had long since soaked their tiger-striped flight gear with rivers of sweat from the tropical sun as they sat in their respective cockpits while the crew chief connected the huffer to their aircraft. As he started the flow of hot air into the right J-79 GE-17 engine, Colonel Pewitt advanced the throttle to 50%, then back to idle, while pressing the ignition button and checking the EGT gauges for light-off, as the engine started screaming and wailing its way to life for their second sortie of the day. Once the number 2 engine had stabilized at 65% RPM, the process was repeated for the left number 1 J-79, and the pilot and Wizzo's hands fluttered across the cockpit, bringing their Phantom 2 to life. Once all checks were complete and chocks were pulled, Colonel Pewitt tuned the radio and called up Da Nang ground, using a curious and long since retired call sign, Chico, a call sign not heard since the withdrawal of the F-100F from fast fact duties over Southeast Asia many months ago now. Chico was always a peculiar sight on the ramp and taxiways of Da Nang during her short life. She only came out in the afternoon, and she was always loaded with 2 huge Su-23A gun pods, each embossed with Spooky the Gunfighter in red paint and 2 pairs of US Navy stock Mark 20 Rockeye cluster munitions. She was never spotted with a wingman, and always taxiing and flying as a single ship. By the 21st of May, 1972, Vietnamization was in full swing, and the pilots, Wizzos, and enlisted personnel of the 366th Tactical Fighter Wing at Da Nang were the last of their kind in South Vietnam. The men still flying and fighting for the United States Air Force in Southeast Asia were there for one reason and one reason alone: to achieve their childhood dream of flying fighters in combat. The 100 mission rule and the Palace Cobra program had assured this, and some of these pilots would lose their lives in pursuit of this dream, for the chance to fly a beautiful F-4, whether qualified or not, and not for the lofty ideals of God and a country that left them behind, or to prevent the fall of another domino in the fight against communism, but for themselves and their squadron mates, and that young American or Vietnamese kid on the ground with an M16. The gunfighters of the 366th had a storied history flying from Da Nang under the leadership of legendary US Air Force pilot and leader Boots Blissett, who pioneered the concept of his hitherto gunless F-4Cs carrying the Su-16A podded ram air turbine powered M61A1 Vulcan cannon into combat over North Vietnam, much to the condemnation of Colonel Robin Olds, commander of the 8th Tactical Fighter Wing at U-Bon Royal Thai Air Force Base. The two would eventually come to blows over this topic in a bar somewhere in far-flung Southeast Asia, with Boots arguing for giving his pilots any advantage they possibly could gain, and Olds staunchly opposed, arguing that USAF Phantom II pilots should fight to the strengths of their training and their aircraft. But that's a story for a different time, and today's tale doesn't involve the fame and glory of chasing MiGs across the North Vietnamese sky or painting red stars on the splitter plate of a Phantom II's intake, but rather a story of a very unique and rather unknown F-4E Phantom II and her crew down in the mud and blood of the Easter Offensive in the waning days of American involvement in Vietnam. As Colonel Pewitt and Bubba in back received their takeoff clearance from Da Nang Tower, they taxied out onto runway 35 right before pushing up the throttles, lighting the burner cans of their smoky J-79s and rocketing down the runway, before the Colonel smoothly pulled back on the stick and rotated off the runway at 140 knots, before coolly sucking up the gear and flaps, with the tower controller clearing him for a left turn to a heading of 300 and a switch to tactical, making a beeline for the DMZ. The desperate situation had finally stripped away much of the bureaucracy of the air war in the South, and it was rapidly becoming the Wild West. By now, the North Vietnamese full-scale Easter Offensive had made forward air controller or FAC operations near the DMZ untenable for the USAF, NVAF, and CIA's preferred FAC aircraft, such as the O-1 Bird Dog, O-2 Skymaster, and A-1 Skyraider. And, as the offensive ground on and on, even the fast FACs, now made up solely of the gunfighters F-4Es and Ds, to drop to treetop level and maintain speeds in excess of 450 knots to evade the gauntlet of radar-guided AAA, SA-2 Guideline, and SA-3 GOA batteries, now occasionally emplaced on the south side of the DMZ. Not to mention the nearly mythological and mysterious Black SAMs reported by American and South Vietnamese aviators. As Colonel Pewitt and Bubba in back switched to tactical, they started to monitor the frequency, listening for the telltale signs of sightings of NVA positions, tank or truck columns, or troops in contact from the dozens of fellow Phantom, Corsair, Thud, Skyhawk, and Tiger pilots prowling across the deep green jungle of the Vietnamese countryside. A veritable paradise, akin to the Garden of Eden, transformed into a green hell thanks to nearly 2 decades of war. Colonel Pewitt, up front, knew the area around the DMZ like the back of his hand. An experienced FAC pilot, he could make out the telltale signs of tank tracks on the red, muddy roads and jungle trails from the NVA's new T-55 and PT-76 tanks, and even tell if those tracks were fresh or not, all while banking and jinking at treetop level at high transonic speeds to avoid the ever-present threat of small arms and AAA. As Chico 1-1 bobbed and weaved their way towards the DMZ at 470 knots of indicated airspeed, while scanning the jungle canopy for any sign of the NVA for their cannons and rock eyes, Bubba and Pewitt heard the faint sounds of distress calls on the TAC Freak to a FAC in the area from an ARVN infantry unit in the A Shao Valley, in danger of being overrun by a much larger unit of NVA regulars attacking across the Rao Lao River. Colonel Pewitt immediately transmitted that Chico was available, and before he could even get a reply from the FAC, he rolled his Phantom over and pulled back the stick in a hard left-hand turn, putting the A Shao Valley on his nose and lighting the burners to buster his way towards the small, strategic valley where more United States Air Force personnel had been decorated for valor and gallantry than any other piece of real estate on the planet, sadly, some of them posthumously. Nestled between towering mountain ranges, and with a floor of densely packed elephant grass, rice paddies, and the Rao Lao River, the A Shao Valley sits astride the South Vietnamese and Laotian border, some 40 nautical miles west of the holy city of Hue, and has served as a conduit for North Vietnamese supplies and personnel, streaming into the south from the Ho Chi Minh Trail since before American involvement in the Vietnam War. Bubba in back listened intently to the calls for help from the trapped and cut off ARVN unit to the FAC. He could make out that NVA troops were in the open, along the north side of the river, with heavy weaponry, and starting to ford across in an attempt to overrun the outgunned and outnumbered ARVN troops and their American advisors on the southern side. This was a perfect target for Chico, and precisely why she was created all the way back in March, which by this point felt like a lifetime ago. The original impetus for the creation of Chico came out of a sense of frustration and desperation as the NVA's Easter offensive overran and shattered numerous ARVN units unprepared to confront a conventional enemy as they poured across the DMZ and east from the Ho Chi Minh Trail and raced southward along 3 axes of advance. Colonel Pewitt, the operations director of the 366th Tactical Fighter Wing, realized that the desperate, dynamic, and ever-changing situation on the ground required a new approach. Legacy FAC tactics had facts or fast facts, find and mark targets for attack by preceding strike aircraft through strafing runs or marking rockets, and long verbal talk-ons. But in this new environment, targets were far too fleeting, and the situation too dynamic for the long and drawn-out process of a fact, fast or slow, locating a target, waiting for strike flights to be assigned to him, marking the target, and then directing strike aircraft onto the target, especially in the newly high-threat environment of the DMZ. Colonel Pewitt's solution to the problem was a high-speed, lone reconnaissance and strike aircraft that could react quickly to developing situations, new intelligence reports of enemy positions, and attack fleeting targets of opportunity in an expeditious manner without the overhead and danger of the FAC-striker interaction. While his new invention was the ultimate Lone Ranger armed reconnaissance aircraft, there was still the small hurdle of getting the whole thing approved by the brass at 7th Air Force, whose ROE and SOPs governed USAF operations in the Southeast Asian theater, and stipulated that any such lone aircraft on an operational sortie must be administered as a forward air controller, even though this aircraft and mission would certainly be neither FAC nor Striker. In a surprise to the officers of the 366th Tactical Fighter Wing, the idea was eventually approved by the 7th Air Force headquarters at Tan Son Nhut Air Base, thanks in part to the deteriorating situation in the north and the unexpected ferocity of the NVA's offensive. But there were stipulations to this approval. The new experiment could not interfere with the 366th sortie generation rate for regularly assigned strike, FAC, and close air support taskings, and no physical modifications could be made to any of the 366 F-4E or D Phantoms. With the idea begrudgingly approved, the leadership of a 366th selected the long-since dormant FAC call sign Chico to adhere to 7th Air Force's ROE and SOPs for lone combat aircraft, while not interfering with active, live forward air controllers directing strike aircraft onto live, time-sensitive targets on the already hectic tactical frequencies near the DMZ. F-4E 37MC tail number 68339 from the 421st Tactical Fighter Squadron, was selected for the aircraft to perform the Chico mission, and would only fly this unique mission with a handful of highly experienced pilots and wizzos, and only after she had completed that morning's strike taskings, whether over Laos, Cambodia, or the South. As a result of the restrictions imposed by 7th Air Force, Chico needed to be quickly and easily configurable into Colonel Pewett's ultimate armed recon fighter, and the armament specialists from both the Air Force and the US Marine Corps squadrons at Da Nang had a field day. What emerged was Chico the Gunfighter, or as she's sometimes known, Spooky the Gunfighter, an F-4E Phantom II armed with her internal M61A1 Vulcan cannon, 2 SUU-23A gun pods, an improved version of the previous SUU-16A, 4 Mark 20 Rockeye cluster munitions, and a centerline 600-gallon Sergeant Fletcher drop tank, an AN ALQ-71 ECM pod in the forward right Sparrow recess, and a pair of AIM-7 E2 dogfight Sparrows for good measure, because you never know what could happen over the DMZ these days, as MiG sightings march their way further and further to the south. The 2 additional Vulcans augmented Chico's ability to perform high-speed, devastating, and most importantly pinpoint accurate strafing runs on soft targets at a moment's notice, key for the low-level armed reconnaissance mission she had been tasked with. Most notably, Mark 20 Rockeyes were procured from the stocks of Marine Corps F-4 squadrons due to their effects against NVA armor, boats, and POL storage facilities. At this point, it was a well-established fact at Da Nang that USAF stocks of Mark 82 Snake Eyes and napalm canisters were basically useless against North Vietnamese armor, even if the 7th Air Force brass couldn't believe it. And the introduction of the AGM-65A Maverick was still a number of months away now. Through my research, it seems that Chico was the only United States Air Force aircraft to employ Rockeyes over Vietnam, and many others seem to hold this view as well. If you have any evidence that says otherwise, I'd love to see it in the comments down below. As Colonel Pewett and Bubba and Back flew Chico into the A Shau Valley, they caught sight of the intense firefight across the river on the valley floor, with columns of billowing smoke as the elephant grass and jungle canopy started to ignite. With no direct contact with the American advisors or the ARVN troops on the ground, the local FAC, most likely a Stormy or Gunsmoke fast FAC, relayed the positions of friendly and enemy units as they made a circle around the battle as it grew in intensity. After a circle, Colonel Pewett was comfortable that he knew where the cowboys and the Indians were. He set up for a series of west to east strafing runs, utilizing Chico's 3 M61A1 Vulcan cannons, under the strict control of the FAC. Lining up on the target, Colonel Pewett let loose with a 3-second burst along a few hundred meters of the northern bank of the river at the origin of the towers of smoke. And while the strafing run was effective, the commander of the ARVN unit radioed to the FAC that they better call off Chico due to the intense amount of 12.7 and 23mm AAA fire emanating from the tree line. But Colonel Pewett visually identified hordes of NVA troops entering the water and fording across the river in their first pass and knew the friendlies on the ground were in a real bind. They were the cowboys, the NVA were the Indians, and he was the cavalry that came to save the day, just like in the old Western movies the Colonel loved as a kid. Undeterred by the ground fire, he and Bubba in back circled around for a second strafing run, adjusting his aim further behind the riverbank to silence some of the ground fire. Scrunching his shoulders up and trying to get as low in the cockpit as he could, as he flew as fast and as low in the strafing run as he dared. The ARVN commander relayed to the fact that the ground fire had been significantly reduced by the second strafing run, but heavy weapons were still firing on either end of his run, and they were starting to zero in and get Chico's range. Additional strafing runs and additional adjustments in aim eventually silenced these guns as well. But there was still the problem of NVA regulars fording the river and assaulting the ARVN position. On his fifth run, Colonel Pewitt and Bubba adjusted their aim out into the river itself, his 20mm round striking the enemy within 30 yards of friendly positions along the southern bank. The crew of Chico knew they were running low on ammunition, fuel, and unable to use their 4 Rockeyes this close to friendly positions. As they pulled up and into a turn to set up for their next run, they looked over their shoulders and were relieved to see the intensity of the battle and the firefight had waned significantly, and the pressure on the ARVN unit was broken thanks to their efforts. On their 6th and final strafing run, they finally ran out of ammunition in their internal M61A1 and the 2 SUU-23A gun pods halfway through the strafing pass. With their guns dry, fuel running low, and the attack in the A Shao across the Rao Lao broken, the FAC cleared Chico off station, and Pewitt and Bubba in back turned to the southwest and made their way back to Da Nang for another safe and uneventful landing under the blood-red Southeast Asian sunset. The next day, the Colonel and Bubba were told that they had killed in excess of 60 North Vietnamese Army regulars and saved the lives of many ARVN troops and their embedded American advisors. They would both be nominated for the Silver Star for this action. This was a telling of the most famous mission in Chico the Gunfighter's short, violent, and relatively unknown career over South Vietnam that lasted only from March through June of 1972. A tribute to this mission will forever be enshrined in Wade Meyer's painting, fittingly titled Chico the Gunfighter, that you can see here and in the thumbnail of this video. And while it isn't a sexy and flashy story of chasing MiGs through Route Packs 5 and 6, or whiz-bang AIM-7 Sparrows, or establishing Top Gun astride the beautiful beaches of San Diego, it's still an important, if little-known part of the story of McDonnell Douglas's fabulous Phantom, during the evading days of one of the most painful chapters in American history, and the men of a country that hated them. It's also of great interest on Chico's most famous mission. Colonel Pewitt and Bubba were unable to employ their bespoke Mark 20 Rockeyes due to the enemy's close proximity to friendly forces. But Chico did employ her US Navy stock Rockeyes against NVA armor on numerous occasions throughout her short career. But that's a story for another day and another video. Please leave a like and a subscribe if you enjoyed the video, and if you are a DCS F-4E Phantom II pilot, I cannot recommend the book Palace Cobra by Ed Rasmus enough about flying the F-4E in the waning stages of the Vietnam War.